Hello, and welcome to the next episode in our How to Apply IFRS 16 video series. I'm Jessica Taurae. I lead our global technical team for lease accounting under IFRS. I'm joined today by Richard Brown from our global technical team. Today we'll talk about how to calculate the lease term when the lessee, the lessor, or both have extension or termination options. The lease term is important because lessees will calculate their lease liability based on the payments during the lease term. Richard, can you start by explaining what we mean by extension and termination options?
Absolutely. So we'll start with extension options because they're often the easiest to think about. An extension option, and a very common type is a lessee-only extension option, means that the lessee has the right to continue the lease after the initial term. So for example, if I lease a car for 3 years and I have the choice afterwards to continue that lease for a fourth year, that's an extension option that the lessee has. So IFRS 16 gives us quite a lot of guidance on lessee extension options, and the extension option is included in the lease term if the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise the extension option. Reasonably certain, as I said, does have quite a lot of guidance there, and in fact we do have other materials that go into that in detail, and links will be provided, so we won't do today. Termination options are then almost equivalent to an extension option. So if you have that same car lease where I'm leasing for 3 years with an option to extend to 4, or it's a 4-year car lease with an option to terminate after 3, those have the same substance. So the assessment would be worded as am I reasonably certain to not terminate after 3 years? Either way, the question is, am I reasonably certain to continue using the asset? If I am, then it will be included in the lease term.
And what about if the lessor has the option to terminate?
So lessor options are the easiest. So lessor options, you always assume that the lease will continue. So same example with the car lease. Let's say it's a 3-year lease. Officially, it continues to 4 years. If the lessor does not terminate, we assume the lessor doesn't terminate. We assume it continues for the full life. In this case, 4 years. It kind of makes sense conceptually because the lessee can't control that. You assume the lessor would want to continue the lease. They'll keep getting a return from their asset. And as the lessee, I have no power. I'm committed to the full 4 years without any say in it.
And of course, I'm sure there's leases where both the lessee and the lessor have the options. What do we do in those situations?
So when both the lessee and the lessor have the option to terminate is very much the hardest situation. And then where we've spent a lot of time debating over the last few years, because it can make a big difference, particularly in some jurisdictions where these kind of arrangements are fairly common, and equally in some industries where there are leases that are structured to initially have a fairly short term, and either party can choose to terminate, but in practice they do continue using the asset. So the guidance that we do have is that a lease where both parties can terminate without permission from the other and with no more than an insignificant penalty, you stop the lease term at the date that both of them can terminate it from. The real challenge there is what the word penalty means. So the word penalty isn't defined anywhere in IFRS 16, and in fact this is to even get to more than an insignificant penalty, but before you decide if it's insignificant you need to know what the penalty is. So we think the penalty should include both direct payments from the lessee to the lessor or vice versa, but it should also include economic disincentives, so economic penalties. If I terminate this lease, I'm going to have to go and find a replacement. There's going to be costs of negotiating the new lease, of implementing the new asset in my business, and those should be considered as well. Equally, from the lessor's side, the fact that I'd have to find an alternative lessee, an alternative tenant, whatever the word is, depending on the category of asset you're using, but we think you should consider those as well to see if there's really an economic ability for both parties to walk away or not. Although it's not defined in the standard itself, the IASB staff did do a webcast recently where they mentioned this, and they said that when they were writing the standard, they did have that broad interpretation of penalty in mind.
And of course, that's consistent with what US GAAP, but they define penalty and actually do encourage it to be read broadly. So thanks, Richard. So just to summarize, for each option, you need to understand whether it's a lessee option, a lessor option, or both. For a lessee option, you include the period in the lease term if it's reasonably certain to continue the lease. For a lessor option, you always include the period in the lease term. And if both parties have a termination option with no more than an insignificant penalty, then you exclude that period from the lease term. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join us for the next video. And for more information, please visit pwc.com/IFRS16. Thank you.